Yo, what's up, Granbluers? Hope you're doing well. Granblue Fantasy Relink is a game I consider myself to be very fond of in the short time since its release. I've been waiting for this game for years, and now that it's here, I'm really happy with the finished product. But saying all that, I couldn't call it a perfect game or something that's free of criticism. I see a future for this game where it's even better than what we have currently. No, I'm not just talking about new bosses and characters to play as, but more so about the gameplay loop, build variety, and multiplayer system. If you like Granblue content, whether it's more guides or discussion pieces like this, I'd appreciate a subscribe. Let's get on with the video. Firstly, to list some things about this game. I love the combat, character feel, and the boss fights themselves. They're not so overwhelming that people should feel discouraged to queue up in a quick match or enter a fight not knowing the mechanics, but it doesn't just feel like wailing on a really tanky health bar. As I'm a bit over 100 hours now on Relink, I feel like some of the concerns I had in my first impressions hold true now and probably will stick through the game's life, unless Cygames ends up responding to some of the feedback we've given. To preface this video, this feedback is obviously not something the developers themselves would watch, but more so to extend the discussion to other players and comment this feedback onto their website, which I'll have linked below. Not saying you need to agree with me or I hold some grand opinion, but maybe what I'll say will resonate with you or spark some other idea you have that could be used to improve Relink further. In Granblue Fantasy Relink, when you start out, you'll probably have a grand old time. You pick a character, they play super differently from one another, and the progression feels very smooth. Once you get yourself into the final tier of difficulties where you will essentially hit the pinnacle of your character's capabilities, not just in build, but also in player skill. After all that time, you'll probably be pretty good at your character and have a great understanding of how they work. If you get tired of playing your current character, the next thing to do would be to build other characters you're interested in and learn how they play. The problem I feel starts to emerge once you've experimented with one character of each archetype. That's not to say there's no depth or once you've played one, you've played them all. Rather, once you've built one character, you have built them all. This is a problem that people have discussed since a few days into the release. Relink's endgame mostly boils down to just building for damage and constantly increasing the amount of damage your character can deal. I wish I could say there's more to it, and there's some nuance to how you build your character, but honestly I can't. Characters have a gimmick, and this gimmick typically decides how said character will play. I will say this is not true for every single character. If you take a character like Charlotta or Lancelot, you could totally just play them as someone that revolves around their gimmick. For Lancelot, this would be doing fast, consistent damage and noping out when you need to using his dodge to proc invincibility or to get out of a sticky situation. Charlotta has a built-in parry that allows her to stick to the boss like glue. You could also play these two as Berserker style characters where they'll sit there, face tank, and heal up the damage with sigils like Drain and Stoutheart. This works for Charlotta and Lancelot because they're fast-hitting characters, but if you look at the sigil drain itself, it sucks for slow hitters because the heal isn't relative to the damage or move you're using beyond the cap. The heal depends on how much damage you deal, yes, but the cap itself is 500, which is extremely low. With that, you might start getting an idea of what I'm talking about. The build variety in Relink is very stagnant, but the problem itself is not the damage cap or too many sigils for one part of the build. I wanted to make this video before the Lucilius raid gets showcased on the 9th because there is a potential they'll answer my concern, but considering this was on their roadmap leading up to the release, I don't know if they really had enough time to address a lot of the community's concerns with builds or the game at this point. Better to get this out now rather than too late into the game's life. The problem of build variety does not stem from damage cap. Damage cap is just a symptom of the problem. To prove my point, we can do an example build of what's quote-unquote optimal for a character. An optimal build consists of stamina, tyranny, this could be any damage cap sigils, but these two are the most common for good reason, 4 damage caps, war elemental, 3 supplementary damage sigils, 2 slots left maybe for 1 quality of life sigil, and your character's unique sigil. This isn't every character's build path again, but most of the builds in the game can be boiled down to this. You could simplify many of the damage sigils themselves to be the same. The only reason why you want different ones is because the bonuses stack better for building damage than just stacking one of the same trait. Now, as an example, let's say the Lucilius raid will introduce level 6 sigils alongside a new weapon type. They could make it so these level 6 sigils have 3 traits on them, or just 2 traits but the levels are even higher on these sigils, allowing you to max out things like damage cap with less slots. This is where you should start raising some eyebrows and seeing the issue. If you haven't already, the problem is what else are you going to slot in besides a DPS build or some quality of life like Potion Hoarder? Fundamentally, the build does not change, the playstyle does not change, thus the game doesn't change. What bothers me about this is while yes, it'd be nice to have less slots needed for DPS, and maybe that leaves room to experiment with things such as Break Assassin, Overdrive Assassin, or some defense slots, for the most part nothing will change. If we look at the distant cousin of Granblue Fantasy Relink, Monster Hunter, this is a non-problem in Monster Hunter as you get into the further tiers of difficulty and new tiers of armor get introduced. You can slot in more decorations, their version of sigils, and craft the build you'd like. Now, that game obviously has players still building strictly for damage and trying to get the fastest clear possible, but I'd argue while it could be the majority, I still don't think it's as drastic as compared to players that will do different things in the combat. For starters, Monster Hunter allows you to play actual support builds or weapons. You're able to buff allies, put monsters to sleep, paralyze them, knock them out, put them in traps, or use other consumables. So we have different playstyles, status ailments, and multiple tools for each fight. From that, you should be able to understand why I feel like this game lacks a bit of oomph. It teeters a bit too close on the simple side when I think new options are a great way to not only revamp, but keep the game fresh and people constantly talking about it. More so than just a cool new update with characters people like, a weapon to grind for, and a new fight. To say it again, I do think the core loop of Relink is great, but I do think some extra depth would give this game room for people to theorycraft and do different things than just build for damage. This point is for viewers, not for content creators to make new videos or guides on how to build characters. I do have some guides on my channel and I do think guide content is helpful, but I don't really care about the content creation aspect of this request. I think it would benefit players themselves to discuss different things other than damage cap, meta, and give new life to multiplayer experiences. To help illustrate my point, let's take Lancelot as an example since I used him earlier. Lancelot has the ability to lock bosses in place with his freeze skill. There are other characters in the game with crowd control moves. I believe Io has one as well, and a few characters have slows such as Vasaraga and Percival. This is a cool way to give players extra time to DPS and allows them to play in a team-oriented style. But this is only one ability. Once it's down, your focus is DPS only. Imagine if weapons had status effects you could build up on them, or maybe a way to bring throwables into battle, like pocket barrels, and play a bit into the throwable style just like some of the sigils let you. Just some wacky ways to do DPS or have unique boss fights such as constantly being able to freeze them by bringing multiple water characters, or weapons and play into a crowd control style. I'm not advocating for this to be some broken, lock the boss in place for the entire fight, but just unique things you could do so not every player builds the same way and characters go from being one-trick ponies to multifaceted ways to express yourself. The way stun works currently, it allows you to break parts quicker and fill the link gauge faster when it's up. This is cool, but not really that useful in a group setting because you'll fill it up naturally as you play. Breaking parts, aside from the extra rewards, does nothing to alter the fight, so it has them feeling a bit static in some aspects. One fight that is cool and can be a bit dynamic, just a quick spoiler warning, this boss is only available in a Proud Mode fight, so if you haven't unlocked all the bosses or difficulties and want to see each encounter yourself, skip to the next timestamp please. The boss Pietà allows you to pick its element in the fight. The way you do this is by breaking the crystals you don't want it to be, and leaving one crystal left of the element you do want it to become. The only 3 options are earth, water, and fire, but if your team has one of the elements to counter these, let's say you have a Catalina or Vayne, and you break everything except the fire crystals, now when you do SBA chains you can have these characters started off and you'll do more damage. It can dynamically shift the fight. While it isn't that different compared to playing the fight normally, it is a cool way to try and introduce mechanics and options in a boss battle. I'm not advocating for MMO level mechanics, but having things to dynamically shift encounters, whether this is through options a boss fight presents or through new build options. I think it's a good way to keep the game feeling fresh. The reason why Monster Hunter fights can feel so fresh even on the 100th kill is due to your own loadout shifting, and also the attack patterns of monsters can shift depending on where you are in the fight, what it's already done. You get my point. Of course, an experienced hunter will be able to memorize telltale signs of an attack coming or pattern, the same way you can do in this game, but it's less scripted in its approach. In Relink, boss fights open up the same every time, which isn't a bad thing, just means the game could use some shaking up to keep a fight feeling new, especially if you need to do the fight 10, 20, or even hundreds of times like in the case of the Proto-Bahamut fight for the Terminus weapon. Some new ways to shake things up for our loadout so we're not all playing the character the same way would be nice. Some characters do have a full arsenal of usable skills. I'd argue a Vasarago player could have a good reason to bring each one of their skills to a fight. I'm not saying all of his skills are best in class, top tier. Of course, some skills are better than others, but you might not see a Voss player run the same loadout as another. Percival is a character that I would say got the short end of the stick. Not because he isn't fun or a bad character, in fact he's very good, but he is only a one-trick pony. Rinse out skills to spam his charge attack. You could argue Vasarago only wants to use his charge attacks as well, which I'd agree with, but he also has a skill to survive any attack and play greedy, or you could use this in tandem with another skill to cover the damage your allies would receive and tank for them, or skills that want to drain his health in return for a damage buff. We already talked about how buffs aren't all that great in Relink, but there is variance in his kit which I like to see. Long story short, I would love to see some new builds be made or ways to play the game that aren't just damage. Of course, if you get bored of a character, you can always play a different one and have a new way to do damage, but not everybody wants to play different characters and would rather get a different experience or have some nuance in how you tackle your respective character. One way is to have bosses with more mechanics so there is variance to the fights, but I'd argue the more fun approach is to give players more tools to use on said fights. This last point is a bit subjective, but those are my 2 cents. One thing I'd like to point out, considering the Lucilius raid will be here on March 14th, and that is our first content update for the postgame, is that he will be level 200 and seemingly does a lot of damage from the footage we saw earlier from Cygames as a sneak peek of the encounter. I do want this fight to be tough and not something that's a cakewalk, but I hope the extent of the fight doesn't boil down to a DPS check to meet, because that is also part of the reason why damage is so enforced in the community. Some of the bosses have DPS checks you need to beat to clear the fight. This isn't every boss, but it does seem like a mechanic they like using. It's not something I'm personally fond of, but I understand its existence. I just hope not every new fight is a bigger health bar with a DPS check reinforcing this DPS only mindset, but rather a fight with patterns to learn, different ways to play, and gives players a moment to shine with their character pick. The only other topic I'd like to quickly go over is multiplayer. The way multiplayer is right now, it's fun, but it doesn't give many players a reason to pursue playing with others, or a reason to tackle the quick quests. Currently, if you choose quick quest, you will be awarded with medallions at the end that could be traded in at Sierra Carte's shop for things such as silver centrums, sigils, or other treasures needed for weapons or sigil enhancements. I think the premise of this concept is a good one. A high-level player that has experienced the content in-game could help out a struggling player, or those that want to play online in whatever quest and still be rewarded. The online is kinda dead outside of the high difficulty content, because that's what people are farming, and where the players logging in every day or so reside. The problem with the current multiplayer system is that people don't use the quick quest function that often because the rewards aren't necessarily as good as farming the quest for materials yourself, thus slowly but surely dwindling the online population to those only doing the new content. This is horrible and something MMOs mostly struggle with. I think there are better ways to deal with the system. The first way to incentivize high level or those that want to play with others to do so is by increasing the medallion amount per quests. Maybe give 3 to 4 instead of just 1 to 3 depending on if you have tickets or not. Maybe those numbers are a bit off, but from what I know, if you don't use tickets, you'd only get 1 silver and 1 gold per quest, on top of being nerfed, so it's not like you're curb stomping the content for these new players anyway. This can cause a player at the end to feel fatigued, or that the quick quest function is completely pointless even though you can get things such as silver centrums out of it, because 1 silver centrum is the equivalent of 24 quests grinded if you don't have tickets, so the rewards aren't amazing. I think another thing that could be done is throw in an option to buy curios from Sierra for gold or silver medallions. This doesn't have to be specific that you can choose which tiers to get, but rather just a way to infinitely spend gold medallions and silver so that there is constantly a reason to funnel players through quests and to play with others, thus keeping the online community constantly engaging with the game. I think increasing the depth of character builds and fixing reward structure of multiplayer are the two best ways to increase longevity and fun for players. Some small quality of life features I think the multiplayer could use is upon completing the quest, if some players would like to repeat the quest but others wouldn't, the lobby doesn't send everybody back to town. Just the players that want to go back to town. Those that chose to repeat would be put into a group with the other player until they can find 2 or 1 more player needed to continue the quest. If nobody is doing the quest, make one player the host and give them the option to either make it a closed party or proceed with just the players there and maybe one AI companion to fill that last slot. This shortens queue times and keeps people playing. Granblue Fantasy Relink has been a joy to talk about with other people and to play. I just think there are some minor kinks that if ironed out would not only strengthen this game's staying power, but provide even more satisfaction to players of this boss fight hunting style genre. I can only speak for myself, so maybe I'm wrong, but if my suggested fixes resonated with you or sparked your own idea, please leave it in the comments or submit it to Cygames themselves, and maybe some of this can be added down the line. If you enjoyed this style of video, please consider subscribing. Thank you so much for your time, and have an amazing day.